Welcome to Module 4. Now that you have a basic understanding of vapes and vape juice, you understand how your brain works in relation to dopamine, your two brains, and nicotine, and you also understand the three basic reasons why anybody vapes, we're going to elaborate on each one during the next three modules. We're starting off with this module, Reason 1 for Vaping, Nicotine Addiction. Remember that you and everybody else in the world only vapes for three reasons. The first one, nicotine addiction, formed after you started, and the second two, your thoughts about vaping and the way you're using nicotine to process your emotions, are what led you to vaping in the first place. This course is going to take care of all three of these one by one so that you can become a permanent non-vapor for good. In this module, you're going to learn about reason 1, nicotine addiction. I decided to start with this one because it will benefit you more to learn about nicotine addiction before you learn how to override your animal brain. So, in this section, you're going to learn the basics about addiction, nicotine withdrawals, and also get a detailed timeline of what your quitting journey will look like after you decide to take your last hit. So before moving forward with this section on addiction, I have an important note that I think is an appropriate place to put here. I'm a life coach trained with a non-abnormal, non-clinical approach to mental health and certain addictions like nicotine and non-diagnosable overeating. Although I do have a 4-year degree in applied psychology, clinical mental health care experience working in a psychiatric hospital with many different types of clinical mental health disorders, and a very good foundation on clinical mental health issues in general. That means I do not personally label, diagnose, or treat mental health disorders, but I do see the importance of that system existing. My belief on nicotine addiction and the client, aka you, is that you are whole, worthy, healthy, and not broken, aka you do not have a disorder and there's nothing to diagnose. This is a fundamentally different approach than most, emphasize most, therapeutic and or psychiatric perspectives takes, whose aim is typically to diagnose and quote-unquote fix the client or the patient. So be mindful that although I'm going to talk about addiction in this section, I will not be doing it from a clinical perspective, which means I do not think there's anything wrong with you or that you are mentally ill. I find it incredibly helpful when it comes specifically to nicotine addiction to take this perspective. However, please be mindful that this is not a blanket statement for all types and severities of addiction, and if you think you need a clinical approach or a diagnosis to help you quit vaping or quit any other substances or addiction for that matter, please see a licensed clinician like a psychiatrist whose methodology may be more appropriately suited to help you. At the end of the day, decisions based on your health should be made with your own discretion. With that said, I view nicotine addiction as a completely normal and expected side effect that occurs with regular use of an addictive, dopamine-releasing substance. And if you're here, that means you're probably aligning with this belief. Therefore, I find labeling nicotine addiction as an abnormal occurrence is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the brain works. You are currently addicted to nicotine because your animal brain is working exactly as it was designed to. Your brain is not the issue. The mismatch between how your brain was designed and the environment it is in today is the issue. The way out is simply learning how to override your animal brain's desire to seek dopamine. Remember the motivational triad. This is exactly what this program is designed to do. Let's take a look at the basic understanding of addiction. Okay? There are many different ways to define addiction. Below you can see 3 examples. Wikipedia defines addiction as a biopsychosocial disorder characterized by repeated use of drugs or repetitive engagement in behavior such as gambling, despite harm to self and others. Dr. Anna Lembke is a world-renowned addiction specialist and psychiatrist, and she defines addiction broadly as the continued and compulsive consumption of a substance or behavior like gambling, gaming, sex, etc., despite its harm to self and or others. And this is my favorite definition by neuroscientist and professor Andrew Huberman, and he defines addiction as a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. The reason why I like this definition so much, Andrew Huberman's, is because it's the one that aligns the most with my belief about dopamine abuse. If you continue to abuse your dopamine system, you will get less and less motivated to do things outside the realm of the addictive substance. And eventually, you'll find yourself not having motivation nor knowing what it is you want to begin with outside of the addiction. There's a ton of different variables, both environmental and genetic, that contribute to a person's susceptibility to addiction. And in today's society, it's possible to get addicted to nearly anything. There are many different kinds of addictions, but it's important to understand that all addictions have one thing in common. They're created and sustained by our dopamine reward system. All right, so I just wanted you to look at this list and show you that you can literally get addicted to anything in modern society. And I also want to be mindful that a lot of the things that we have problems with in terms of addiction in modern society have been artificially concentrated by our society to release more dopamine than they would naturally release in the wild. Okay, so things like sex have actually been concentrated to be porn, and porn in its very essence is the most concentrated form of sex that you can have. It's like a fantasy that's very concentrated. It's like the most attractive people in the most attractive 10-minute clip you can possibly get. So it's a very concentrated artificial version of porn. And there's many different ways to do this, like adult media, books, images, OnlyFans. There's even a website online where you can buy porn stars' used objects like clothing. So like literally any kind of sexual perversion in porn you can get online these days. So it's a very, very common addiction. Food is something we get addicted to, especially in modern society, because we get addicted to concentrated ingredients like corn syrup and flour. Gambling you can do at casinos, but also now recently on your phone from home at any time, anywhere. Drugs, there's literally endless drugs and endless ways to ingest them that are in our society. You can literally get addicted to pretty much any drug. Alcohol is one of the most damaging addictions that people have in their life. It's very destructive to society, so please use that responsibly. Medications, in general, medications are a blessing to society, but they're very overused and overprescribed, especially in the United States. They're often used to numb emotions rather than for their intended medical purposes. Nicotine is incredibly potent. Remember that nicotine is not like sucking on a tobacco leaf like what used to happen. It's now like the most concentrated form of nicotine that's potentially even possible for you to ingest. So that's why vaping, again, remember we did a module on that talking about how it's the perfect storm for addiction. Social media is actually designed to be addictive, everything about it. Books and learning, you can actually get addicted to learning and courses. We call these people courseaholics in the self-development realm. You can get addicted to TV and video games. And remember, TV and video games are like the most concentrated form of your life imaginable. You can live an entirely very action-packed life in just like a matter of 90-minute film. So that is a fake version of all of the highlights in life. It's so concentrated. That's why it's so addictive to watch things like that. Workaholics are very common in the United States, particularly in big cities like New York and Washington, D.C. Shopping is a very big addiction for a lot of people, and a lot of people aren't even aware that they have addictive tendencies with their spending habits. So, if you're not sure, it's good to look at how you're spending your money and start to pay attention to the emotions around spending. If you get a really big dopamine rush when you're watching Amazon, when the box arrives, and that's the whole ritual, it's very, very likely that there could be some addiction kind of brewing behind the scenes with your compulsive spending. Caffeine, it's estimated that 64% of Americans drink coffee at least once a day. That's just coffee, okay? That's not including teas or energy drinks, which are huge in the United States. And then finally, exercise. Exercise, you can get addicted to the dopamine release when you exercise. Too much of a good thing, though, can be a bad thing. And that goes for anything on this list, okay? And then just for funsies, I put some fun, I shouldn't say fun, but some random little interesting addictions that people have. If you've ever seen the show My Strange Addiction, you'll know that people can literally get addicted to anything. Your brain is strange like that. It can find ways to release dopamine with any kind of weird thing. So biting nails, cleaning, vacuuming, consuming anything. There's people who eat toilet paper I've seen on that show. I don't know how legitimate that show is, but toilet paper, bricks, like just any kind of weird thing, smelling candles, inhaling things, and even things like sucking your thumb can become an addictive thing. So in modern society, we are bombarded with addictive substances and vices. However, it's possible to navigate this list without running into any serious addictions if you learn how to override your animal brain's desire for dopamine with your more advanced and intelligent human brain. Okay? You're going to learn more about this for the rest of this program, but for now, I just wanted to remind you that it's entirely possible for you to enjoy things in life without becoming addicted to them. Okay? So in case this list made you a little anxious or squirmy, like you can enjoy pretty much anything in the world, any substance, any vice, anything, without becoming a full-on addict if you learn how to override your brain and use it properly, okay? Remember, you're going to do this by learning how to manage your emotions properly and also the thoughts in your head. And we're going to talk about that more as this course progresses. Remember that the reason something becomes addictive is based on the foundation of how it affects your dopamine, okay? So this is very good to know, is that the addictive potential of anything is based on two things. One is the speed of the dopamine release, and two is the intensity of the dopamine spike. So nicotine's very addictive because of how it's been engineered in vapes. It's already an addictive substance because it releases dopamine, but remember, vapes have been engineered to have a lot of nicotine in them because of the nicotine salts. So they give you a very intense dopamine spike, more than you would get from sucking on a tobacco leaf, okay, or even smoking a cigarette. In addition, the speed of the dopamine release is very, very quick because of how vapes release water vapor. It's even quicker than smoke. So vaping releases a lot of dopamine. It does it very quickly in about 10 seconds or less. That is why nicotine addiction, especially with vapes, and why so many people have more trouble quitting vapes than they do with cigarettes, because it's actually, by technical standards, a more addictive way to get nicotine. So in the next couple slides, we're going to compare what healthy dopamine function looks like compared to addiction, okay? So healthy dopamine function looks like this. You ingest a substance or you get a substance, these dopamine spikes, your dopamine lowers to below baseline, okay, below, so you actually feel worse than before you did the substance. And then if you let time pass, it will naturally get you back up to your normal levels of baseline dopamine. And then you can use the substance again, it spikes, it goes back down, you let time happen, and then it levels back out. Here's what it looks like. All right, so this is an example with coffee. Please be aware that this is like very simplified, okay? This is not the only substance that's using your dopamine during this chart, but this is a good way to visualize healthy dopamine function, okay? So let's say you have a coffee at 8 in the morning. Your dopamine spikes, and then your dopamine lowers to below baseline, because remember, once you have a spike, you have to go below where you started. That's called equilibrium or homeostasis. And then we allow time, and then at 1 p.m. we have another coffee, okay? And then your dopamine spikes, and then it goes back below baseline, and then you give more time, and it goes back to normal baseline until you have another coffee the next day. This is what healthy dopamine function looks like. Let's look at it with a chart. So let's say you wake up on a normal day, you have your coffee, your dopamine spikes up, and then after your coffee, it goes below baseline. Okay, so that's your 8 a.m. coffee, and then throughout the morning, your dopamine levels rebuild. Remember that dopamine is a finite but renewable substance, so that will automatically renew itself if you give it ample time. Let's say that 1 p.m. hits and you have another coffee. Okay, this happens again. It goes back to the baseline. And then let's say later on in the day, you're all good. Everything went good. You're having a nice day. And then you decide to have a beer. So normal thing again, spikes, goes back down, and then it levels out. Now, the most important thing to notice with this chart is that with normal healthy dopamine function, your normal levels of baseline are having time to get back to the same baseline you started. Okay, so this dotted line is your baseline. You can see that because you're not overusing your dopamine levels, you're at the same level that you started with. All right, so now let's look at dopamine function with addiction, okay? So you have a substance, your dopamine spikes, it goes below baseline, and then you use the substance again, okay? Then it spikes and then goes below baseline. Now, the main difference, as you can see with these two models, is that the user does not allow their dopamine to return to baseline before they use the substance again, okay? Remember that dopamine is a finite but renewable. That means that in order to compensate for continual dopamine spikes, the normal baseline dopamine levels must go lower and lower and lower until sufficient time is given to restore dopamine levels to a normal baseline, which addiction prevents from doing. That means the more an addict uses, the worse they feel, and the more they need to use to feel baseline normal again. This is a huge problem for a multitude of reasons. For one, addiction will leave you at a lower baseline of dopamine. That means you're going to feel worse than your normal mood would be if you never use a substance to begin with. Second, you're going to lose interest in doing things that don't spike dopamine, like the substance. That means you'll have decreased drive, you'll be feeling lazy, unmotivated, and not really caring about or setting any meaningful and challenging goals. Third, if the addiction gets severe enough, depression will occur because there will not be enough dopamine to not be depressed. So as you continue to lower your baseline levels of dopamine, your mood's falling. So if you're so in the throes of addiction that you don't have baseline dopamine to be okay, then you're not going to be okay. That's pretty much what happens with depression and addiction. And then finally, forget about having meaningful goals, work, relationships, etc. At a certain point, your brain is more focused on getting that dopamine spike than anything else, okay? And this is one of the main philosophies of why I teach people to get away from nicotine addiction, because especially with vaping, when you're constantly using something that releases dopamine on that level, at that speed, nothing else seems as important. So when you remove that and you get back to a normal level of dopamine function, the things that you want in life that would actually benefit you and create meaningful goals, those become a lot more important. So it's not necessarily the negative effect that vaping has in terms of health. It's the mental health, the drive, the motivation, the knowing what you want. That's the issue when you're constantly using addictive substance. So there's a lot more to the picture than just the health effects of vaping. All right, so please be mindful that this image is a bit dramatized. It is not going to account for every single dopamine release and everything that's going on in your brain, but it's going to be just enough to help you understand how dopamine and addiction function together, and that's the use of this. So as you continue to use a lot of dopamine, your brain and body must compensate by lowering your overall levels of baseline. Remember, that's your reserve dopamine. When you try to take out more money in the bank than you actually have, you're going to get charged an overdraft fee as an additional slap in the face. Dopamine works in the same way, okay? So as you keep using something that's abusing your dopamine, you're going to feel worse and worse. And here's how this works. Let's look at this chart. So let's say you're at 100% dopamine. You use something that uses 20% of your current baseline available dopamine. You're left to 80%, and then you give it a little bit of time to compensate. But before you're back to your normal baseline, you use something that uses a lot of dopamine again. And as you keep doing this, you get lower and lower, and eventually you're left with less dopamine than you started with. That means you're at a lower baseline or reserve amount. You're going to feel worse. Okay? So as you keep getting addicted to something, one of the ways to know if it's helping you or hurting you or if it's creating an issue is to really pay attention to how you're feeling. And some of the work that you should do if you're trying to quit any addiction, really, and we're going to talk about this in the emotional section, is just to pay attention to your levels of anxiety or stress surrounding the addiction. Using it before or after, it's going to be a good way to understand if you are using more dopamine than your body necessarily has to use, and if your mood is going to lower because of that. All right, and then this is how dopamine works with addiction. So remember, you start the day with your baseline amount. You go up, you spike down, you give it some time. Now here's where it gets interesting with addiction, is that with addiction, you're not giving it enough time to get back to your baseline amount. So you're using a dopamine spike, again, before you are back to baseline. That means that you're going to go actually further down after you spike. And now that keeps happening. As you can see, you get lower and lower. So the main characteristic of addiction is that you're actually not at your normal baseline, okay? So as a final note, a lot of vapors don't actually start their day on their baseline level. They actually start below baseline because their body has begun to anticipate a quick and intense rush of nicotine and dopamine in the morning. That's why when you wake up, vaping is typically the first thing on your mind because your body's literally craving it. Your mind and your body want it because they expect it. As a nicotine addict, you'll wake up each and every single day in a much lower mood than you would if you were not abusing your dopamine system. Take a minute before moving on to imagine what kind of positive changes you can make in your life if you fix that and woke up feeling great, as opposed to waking up every day in a net negative state of dopamine. Just something to think about. When it comes to addiction, all the addict has to do, assuming there's been no permanent damage done to the dopamine reward system, is to stop using the substance or substances long enough to rebalance the dopamine levels back to a healthy, normal baseline. This rule of thumb is about 30 days to restore normal dopamine levels. Now, this does not mean that if you vape 1 or 2 times in 30 days, you have to start over, okay? A lot of times when I see people who are quitting, they mess up one time and then they imagine in their head that they have to start all over, and this is not helpful. It's daunting. It makes you want to vape more. It makes you filled with negative emotion. So hopefully by now you can see that 1 or 2 dopamine spikes are not the problem with addiction. It's when they get large and frequent that you start having baseline dopamine issues. So one slip up may reset your quitting timer, but it does not reset all the progress you've made on your brain and body. Do not let yourself tell yourself that just because you messed up one time, you're restarting. It's not helpful. It won't serve you. It will create a lot of negative emotion that you'll be very tempted to get out of with vaping, okay? Before moving on to the next slide, I want to go over this one more time. Remember that addiction potential, or the likelihood that something will become addictive, is based on 2 things. 1 is the speed of dopamine release. 2 is the intensity of the dopamine spike. On the next slide, you're going to learn how your society has taken advantage of our dopamine reward system by concentrating things artificially and creating addictions in modern society. Remember when we were talking about the animal brain and the human brain, and I said that our animal brain was never designed to live in societies like we have today? Here is why. For one, modern society is more abundant than our brains are designed to thrive in. Our brains were never designed with the motivational triad to have abundant sources of food in our pantries and abundant sources of income in our bank accounts. In addition, society has concentrated things that we need for survival. It has also concentrated things that we don't need for survival, like nicotine. These artificial substances or things are called false pleasures. False pleasures trigger an unnecessarily high amount of dopamine. False pleasures are more addictive than their natural counterparts. This addictive potential creates an over-desire. Over-desire is the unnaturally high craving or desire created by a false pleasure. When you over-desire false pleasures, normal pleasures no longer seem important. Okay? So this is a lot of words to pretty much say that the things that your society has artificially concentrated, like nicotine, alcohol, sugar, and flour, those things make you want them really badly because they release more dopamine than your brain normally releases. Okay? That's what's creating addiction. It's the mismatch between abundance that we have in society and artificial substances compared to our brain that has no idea those substances exist, and it's going to seek those things out like they're the most important thing in the world. because as far as your animal brain is considered, they are. So in this chart, you can see the normal pleasure versus the false pleasure opposite, okay? So on the left, you have normal pleasures: apples, nuts, seeds, fresh meat. On the right, you have false pleasures that are artificially concentrated by your society. Remember, your animal brain has no idea that these things have been concentrated. It just knows that they release a lot more dopamine than their natural counterpart, so they must be more important because your brain works on dopamine. That's what it thinks is important. That's what it's used in the past to get us to where we are, and that has been the law and the lay of the land. Your brain is mismatched to the current environment, so you've got to learn how this works, and you have to be able to override it by you learning thought and emotional regulation, okay? So on the left, you have apples, nuts, seeds, fresh meat, and then you have donuts, sugar, flour, sunflower oils on the right. Tobacco became vapes, sex became porn, pursuing and achieving goals became video games and TV. Remember that you can literally play an entire person's life in like a day on a video game, as opposed to like achieving natural goals that take a long time and take some effort. Social connection became social media. Fermented fruit became alcohol, and then alcohol has been highly refined and like refined 7 times into the most potent version of itself. Plants became pharmaceuticals. Exercise became EDM workout classes, because obviously you need to be like crazy and running around and have EDM and like lights everywhere in order to be working out. Hunting and gathering and foraging became Amazon 2-day delivery. It comes right to your door. Peace, silence, nature became casinos and online gambling. And I just put this in here as a last note. Even marijuana, a plant that naturally occurs, has been concentrated. So I looked at the levels. In the 70s or 60s, the normal percentage of THC in marijuana was about 2 to 4%. That's also the 70s or 60s, not 10,000 years ago when it was being taken by ancestors. Today's normal THC is like, it goes up to 45%. That's crazy. So we've actually more than 10 times the concentration of THC in normal marijuana products. So everything in our society has been concentrated, and this is the problem, is that concentrated pleasures release concentrated dopamine. Remember, that creates something called an over-desire. The problem with this is your animal brain does not understand the concept of over-desiring because it is not designed to be in this environment where that's even a possibility. It only knows dopamine, and it has no idea it exists in a society filled to the brim with it. Again, in order to quit vaping, you're going to have to learn the skill of not overindulging in false pleasures. That's entirely where your human brain comes in to save the day. You're about to learn this overriding skill set in the next module, but for now, let's finish this module on addiction by looking at the nicotine withdrawal timeline to arm you with the information you need to quit. Remember that there's 3 reasons why people vape. One of them is a chemical addiction, the physical chemical addiction, and that's created by nicotine addiction, the actual chemicals. And then the other part of addiction is the mental and the emotional, the thoughts and the emotions, okay? So understanding that there are 2 types of addiction, it helps you to understand there's also 2 types of withdrawal, okay? In this section, we're talking about the chemical withdrawal, which is the actual physical symptoms you experience when your body is rebalancing its dopamine and other chemical messengers related to addiction, okay? That's the chemical physical withdrawal. And then we also have the mental emotional withdrawal, which is the thoughts and emotions you choose in relation to quitting an addiction, okay? A lot of people mistake the thought and the emotional withdrawal with the chemical withdrawal symptoms. That is why for so many people it's so difficult to quit, because they think that quitting vaping is an emotional experience, which it is not. Quitting vaping from the chemical perspective is going to be including things like headache, nausea, insomnia, but those are not mental emotional withdrawal symptoms. Those are chemical withdrawal symptoms caused by your body not having certain chemicals it was using before with an addiction, okay? So most of the addiction is mental emotional. That's what we're tackling in the next modules. In this module, I'm arming you with information to understand the chemical addiction so that you can separate the 2. That's going to be an important skill set we're going to use in the next couple modules. When it comes to the physical chemical addiction withdrawal symptoms, here's some important things to know. For one, nicotine is a very fast-acting drug. Remember that with vaping, it can reach your brain in as little as 10 seconds. That means the full chemical withdrawal period only lasts about 10 to 14 days. Chemical withdrawal is caused by your body restoring its dopamine and the rebalancing of other chemical messengers in your brain that frequent and heavy nicotine use disrupts. Chemical withdrawal from nicotine will not kill you, okay? You may experience mild to moderate symptoms, but chemical withdrawal from nicotine is so weak that you experience it every single time you go to sleep each night, waking up in withdrawal that's mild to moderate at best. Here is a list of common physical chemical withdrawal symptoms you may experience when you quit vaping, okay? Remember, these are not the mental emotional symptoms of withdrawal. These are all physical and chemical based off of your body being used to having nicotine that is now not being used, okay? So headache, nausea, dizziness, irritability, trouble sleeping, especially on the first night, trouble concentrated, feeling restless, but this is like a restless in your body that's not being caused by your thoughts. It's like a physical restlessness that you can't escape. Constipation, diarrhea, increased appetite, cough, dry mouth, and tight chest. Yes, your chest getting tight actually is a symptom that is telling you that your body's healing, so do not use that as a reason to think that you are doing damage to your lungs. When you quit vaping, you are not damaging your body, I promise you. You are restoring your body to health. All right, so now let's look at the nicotine withdrawal timeline. Remember, again, this is the chemical, physical symptoms, not the emotional or thought symptoms. So after 20 minutes of not using nicotine, your blood pressure drops to normal, your pulse returns to normal, your temperature in your hands and feet return to normal. Remember that nicotine is a vasoconstrictor. That means that it reduces blood flow to the extremities. Okay, so that's why your temperature in your hands and your feet and your extremities drop when you're using nicotine. Hours 1 to 8. Withdrawal starts about 4 hours after your last hit. It's not going to be very strong. You're probably not going to notice nicotine withdrawal symptoms from hours 1 to 8 that are physical and chemical. You might have some thought issues going on where you're thinking thoughts that are making you want to vape. Those are not physical withdrawal symptoms. From hours 8 to 24, noticeable withdrawal occurs. Okay, so this is where your body actually does start to chemically crave the nicotine again. Things like headache, insomnia, trouble focusing may occur, and this is a good time to check in with your quitting mindset. So again, once you get physical symptoms showing up, it's really important to manage your thoughts and your emotions around quitting. It's a very good time to do that at the 8 to 24 hour mark. During days 2 and 3, withdrawal symptoms will typically increase steadily, and they'll peak around day 3. Peak withdrawal symptoms could include shakiness, sweating, constipation, restlessness, and decreased mood. Remember, this is completely normal as your body rebalances its dopamine levels, which will lead to an overall improved baseline mood and less anxiety than when you were using nicotine. Exercise, going to the sauna, and drinking lots of fluids is a really good way to speed up getting the toxins out of your body during this time. During days 3 and 5, you'll experience similar withdrawal symptoms as day 2 and 3, but they should begin to lift and get better. So if you can get past day 3, typically you'll start to feel better, okay? Days 5 to 14, almost all the nicotine and codeine, which is a byproduct of nicotine, are gone from your body around day 10, okay? So this means your body should be completely detoxed and free from physical chemical addiction around day 10 and definitely by day 14. Any desire to use nicotine after days 10 to 14 is completely created by your thoughts and emotions, not by physical chemical nicotine addiction, okay? That means if you're having cravings to vape after the 2-week mark, it's because of one or two and possibly both reasons. Reason 1 is that you're having encouraging thoughts about nicotine and vaping that are creating the cravings and urges to use it, okay? And then the other reason is that you are experiencing an emotion, not a physical withdrawal symptom, and you've conditioned your brain to use nicotine to numb, escape, or avoid it. So when you experience an emotion like anxiety, boredom, or stress, your brain's triggered to have an encouraging thought of vaping again, okay? In order to change that, we're just going to have to reprogram your brain in the next 2 modules a little bit. At this point, you've been armed with a ton of information about vaping, nicotine, dopamine, addiction, and how your brain works. Now you are totally ready to learn the skill set of overriding your animal brain so you can finally align your mind and body with quitting and learn how to manage your emotions and urges so you can become a permanent non-vapor for good. I will see you in the next module.